Hey everybody, I'm here today to talk to you about the restoration of this vintage Ludwig Acrolite snare drum. Now throughout this video I will be throwing up pictures and video clips of the restoration process so that you can sort of get an idea and see what I was doing, and I will also be talking to you about the restoration process as I throw up those pictures and video clips. So the story behind this snare drum is that someone was throwing it out and it was in really rough shape. So I asked the person that was throwing it out if I could have it for free. They agreed, and I took the snare drum home, and I knew that I would have a snare drum that I could use, and it would only cost me the money that I would be putting into the restoration and the time and effort that I would be putting into the restoration because I got it for free. So I'll start off by talking about the condition of the snare drum before the restoration. So as I said before, it was in pretty rough shape, and I'll expand on that right now. It had some rust along the rims, it had some writing on the top head, and it had many dents on the bottom head. In addition, it didn't have any snare wires, the throw-off was pretty much completely broken, and the butt plate was missing a piece. But on the positive side of things, the logo was in pretty good condition, and there was a serial number on the logo that was completely legible. And also it had a muffling assembly that was completely functional. Alright, so now I'll move on to the actual restoration process. Now, take into account that this was the first time that I was restoring a snare drum, or I should say the first time that I was restoring any drum. So I cruised around the internet to get some information, and I spoke to some people that work in the drum industry to get some information as well, and I pretty much just tried to gather as much information as I could before actually going about and restoring the snare drum. So the first step in the restoration process for me was disassembling the snare drum. So I went and I pretty much disassembled the snare drum as much as possible. I removed every part that I could. Now the next step was cleaning all of the parts that I was going to keep. So as I said before, there were some parts that were broken, and I wasn't going to try and fix them. Instead, I just went and got new parts to replace those broken parts because some of them were way beyond being fixed. So I went about and I started to clean the parts that I was going to keep. So, after searching the internet and speaking to some people, I found out that the easiest thing to do was to get some cleaning solution and to use a sponge with a scratchy surface and an old toothbrush to clean the parts of the snare drum. So I started by cleaning the shell. And since the shell was actually in decent condition and it didn't need a lot of cleaning, I was able to just use the sponge with the scratchy surface and the cleaning solution to sort of scrub the shell and remove any marks that it had on it. Once I had finished with the shell, I moved on to the rims. And as I said before, the rims had some rust on them. So I started off by using the sponge with the scratchy surface and the cleaning solution, and I scrubbed the rims with the sponge and I removed most of the rust. But there was still some rust left in the crevices and the curves of the rims. So I went ahead and I used the old toothbrush with the cleaning solution, and I scrubbed all of those small, fine areas with the toothbrush. And that allowed me to remove all of the rust that was left. Once I had finished with the rims, I moved on to the lug casings. And the lug casings weren't really that big, so I didn't use the sponge to clean them, but instead I just used the old toothbrush with the cleaning solution to scrub them. And there wasn't any rust on the lug casings or anything like that, but there were a few marks on them, so I tried to scrub off those marks, and I also tried to get them to be shiny again. Once I was done with the lug casings, I moved on to the tension rods. And the tension rods were also fairly small, so I just scrubbed them with the old toothbrush and the cleaning solution. Alright, so once I had finished cleaning everything with the cleaning solution, sponge, and old toothbrush, I brought it all down to my basement and into the laundry tub to rinse with water. And once I had rinsed everything with water, I got a towel and I dried every piece individually. And I made sure to dry everything as thoroughly as possible because I wanted to avoid any watermarks or rust forming on the parts that I had just cleaned. The next step was to reassemble everything. And I had some old parts that I had cleaned and I was going to obviously reinstall onto the snare drum, and I had also purchased some new parts to replace some of the old parts that were broken. So I started by reinstalling the lug casings, and I did this by putting them into place and finger tightening them at first, and then using a pair of pliers to tighten them completely. Then I installed a brand new strainer that I bought for the snare drum because, as I said before, the old throw-off was broken. So I installed the new strainer, which was actually a Ludwig P85 strainer, and it actually looked great on the snare drum once it was installed. The next step was to install the new butt plate because, as I said before, the old one was missing a piece. So I went to the store and I was looking for the appropriate Ludwig butt plate, and they didn't have it in stock, so I would have to wait a little while to get it shipped in. But they did have a Gibraltar one that fit the mounting holes perfectly. So I decided to go with the Gibraltar one for now, and I obviously installed the new Gibraltar butt plate on the snare drum. But I might swap it out for the appropriate Ludwig one in the future. Once I had finished with the butt plate, I installed the muffler assembly that came on the drum when I first got it. And the muffler assembly was always functional even when I got the drum in its rough condition. But once I had cleaned all of the parts in the assembly, the tension knob was much easier to turn. The next step was to install brand new top and bottom heads on the drum along with the original rims that I had cleaned. And I decided to go with the Remo Ambassador series heads for both the top and the bottom. The final step in the restoration process was to install brand new snare wires. Because, as I said earlier in this video, the snare drum in its original rough condition didn't have any, and I decided to go with pearl snare wires because I simply like the way that they look and sound. So I installed the new pearl snare wires and tightened them to the appropriate tension. And that was basically the restoration process of this vintage Ludwig Acrolite snare drum in a nutshell. Now please take into account the fact that this was the first time that I had ever restored a snare drum. It was actually the first time that I had ever restored any type of drum. So if I missed a step, or if you have any kind criticism, please post it in the comments section of this video. But this video would not be complete without me letting you hear what this newly restored snare drum sounds like. And that's basically it. I hope that you've enjoyed watching the restoration process of this vintage Ludwig Acrolite snare drum. And that's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching.